cemeteries are supposed to be peaceful places, places of rest, places where memories sleep in the earth. Yet many people who walk through these seemingly quiet grounds after sunset report something completely different: shifting shadows, icy whispers, footsteps that follow without leaving prints, and cold hands brushing against their skin even though no one is there. Tonight we're exploring 5 such stories from people who claim they encountered things that should not exist among the stones. Whether these were spirits, echoes, or something far older, nobody knows for sure. What we do know is that these witnesses never looked at cemeteries the same way again. The first story comes from a college student named Aaron who used to cut through a small cemetery on his way back from late night study sessions. It wasn't an old graveyard, just a local one surrounded by broken fences and tall trees. For months, everything felt normal, quiet, empty, nothing more than a shortcut. But one night, as he walked past the oldest row of graves, he noticed a tall shadow standing between 2 headstones. He thought it was a person at first, maybe someone visiting a grave, but as he got closer, the figure didn't move or breathe. It just stood there as if watching him silently. He tried to ignore it and walk faster, but suddenly the figure shifted and stepped out of sight behind a stone that was far too small to hide a human body. He froze because there was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the figure simply vanished. When he finally forced himself to move again, he heard something worse: someone quietly whispering his name from behind the same gravestone. He turned around slowly, expecting to see someone kneeling or hiding, but the entire area was empty. The shadow was gone, the air was freezing cold, and the whisper came again, this time right next to his ear. He ran out of the cemetery without looking back. For weeks afterward, every time he walked near the cemetery gate, he felt like someone was standing just out of sight, watching him. Eventually, he changed his route permanently. He says that whatever was in that cemetery wasn't human, and it knew his name. The second story comes from a groundskeeper who had worked the night shift at a historic cemetery for almost 10 years. He wasn't easily scared and had seen plenty of strange things over the years: flickering lights, fog forming in perfect circles, even odd animal behavior. But one night he experienced something he still refuses to talk about in public. He was locking up the maintenance shed when he heard crying coming from the far section of the cemetery, the one filled with graves from the early 1900s. He assumed someone had snuck in after hours, so he took his flashlight and followed the sound. The crying was soft at first, but grew louder as he approached, almost like a child sobbing. When he reached the section, he saw a small figure sitting on the ground near an old cracked headstone. It looked like a little girl in a pale dress with long hair covering her face. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. When he stepped closer and pointed the flashlight directly at her, she instantly stopped crying. The air became freezing and the girl slowly turned her head. But instead of a face, there was only darkness, a hollow void where features should have been. Before he could react, the girl stood up and sprinted into the shadows at impossible speed, her feet not making a single sound. He searched the area for 20 minutes but found nothing. From that night on, he refused to work alone in that section. He later learned that the grave she sat beside belonged to a little girl who drowned a century ago and whose body was never recovered. People say her spirit wanders the cemetery searching for something she never found in life. The third story involves a couple who liked visiting abandoned locations for photography. One evening, they entered a forgotten cemetery located deep in the woods outside a small town. The place had been neglected for decades: broken stones, sinking graves, crooked crosses, and a silence so thick it felt strange to breathe. They were excited at first, taking pictures of the eerie landscape as the sun set behind the trees. But as soon as darkness settled, the atmosphere changed. The woman noticed a strange mist forming between the graves, thin at first, then slowly rising until it swallowed the lower stones. The man was adjusting his camera when he saw something standing at the far edge of the cemetery, a man-shaped figure dressed in old, torn clothes. At first he thought it was another explorer or maybe a homeless person, but the figure didn't move. It just stared in their direction. When he called out to ask if the person was okay, the figure took one step forward, then another, but both steps were completely silent. The mist behind it thickened, curling around its legs like smoke. The woman grabbed his arm and whispered that she felt something cold crawling up her back, like invisible fingers. They decided to leave immediately. As they hurried through the gravestones, the man looked back one last time, and the figure was suddenly much closer, standing only a few feet behind them, though they hadn't heard a single sound. Its face was pale, stretched unnaturally long, and its eyes were pitch black. It opened its mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the mist around it surged forward like a wave. They sprinted through the woods until they reached their car. Later, when they checked the photos they took, every picture that included the figure was completely distorted, warped shadows, blurred shapes, streaks of light, and in one frame, a handprint on the lens that hadn't been there before. They never returned to that cemetery and later learned that locals avoided it after dark because people had gone missing in those woods decades ago. The fourth story is about a man who used to walk his dog at night through a small cemetery near his neighborhood because it was quiet and peaceful. His dog, a calm and friendly Labrador, never had issues with the walk until one night. As they approached the center of the cemetery, the dog suddenly stopped, growled, and pulled back. He tried to coax the dog forward, but it refused to move, staring intensely at a row of graves. The man looked in the same direction, but didn't see anything unusual. Then, out of nowhere, a strong odor filled the air, the smell of rotting flowers mixed with something sour and metallic. The dog's growling grew louder, and its fur stood on end. Suddenly, the man heard soft footsteps behind him. When he turned around, no one was there. The footsteps came again, this time circling around him, moving between graves. His dog began barking violently at an empty spot. Just then, the temperature dropped so fast that he could see his breath. Something brushed past his leg, cold like ice. The dog whimpered and hid behind him. When he looked again toward the graves, he finally saw a shadow rising from the ground, stretching upward into the shape of a person. It had no clear face, only darkness, and long thin arms that reached toward him. He grabbed his dog and sprinted out of the cemetery. Even after leaving, the dog refused to go near that place ever again. Weeks later, the man learned from an elderly neighbor that a man was buried in that same row after he was found dead under mysterious circumstances. People claimed his spirit was restless and often seen walking through the cemetery at night, looking for something that had been buried with him. The dog, the neighbor said, probably sensed what humans couldn't. The fifth and final story comes from a teenager named Rachel who visited a cemetery with her friends late one night as a dare. They had heard the place was haunted, mostly because of a tragic incident involving a caretaker who died alone on the property. The rumor was that he stayed even after his death, protecting the grounds. The teenagers weren't scared at first. They laughed, joked, explored the old tombstones, and even recorded videos. But things took a dark turn when Rachel wandered away from the group to take some pictures of an old mausoleum. The door of the mausoleum was slightly open, and although she didn't dare go inside, she leaned close to look. When she pointed her phone flashlight inside, she saw what looked like someone standing at the back wall, facing away from her. Thinking it was one of her friends playing a prank, she called out, but the figure didn't move. When she joked that she caught them hiding, the figure slowly turned its head. That was the moment she realized it wasn't any of her friends. Its face was pale, sunken, and its eyes completely hollow. She froze as it stepped closer, its feet dragging against the stone floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure lifted a shaking hand and pointed directly at her, its mouth slowly opening as if trying to speak. Rachel ran back toward her friends, screaming now, and when they saw the terror on her face, they didn't waste time. They all ran toward the gate as fast as they could. Behind them, they heard the heavy stone door of the mausoleum slam shut. The next day, they returned in daylight to check. The door wasn't just shut, it was sealed with an old rusted lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was no way anyone could have been inside when she saw that figure. People say the old caretaker still watches over the mausoleum, making sure no one disturbs the dead resting there. All these stories reveal that cemeteries may not be as silent or peaceful as they seem. Whether the shadows are spirits, echoes, or something darker, one thing is clear: those who walk among the dead after dark sometimes meet beings that don't belong to our world. The people in these stories were never the same afterward. They learned that the boundary between the living and the dead is much thinner than we think. Some cemetery visitors claim they feel watched. Others hear footsteps, whispers, or see figures that vanish into thin air. And some feel cold hands on their skin when nobody is near them. Maybe cemeteries are more than resting places. Maybe they're gateways, windows into something we can't fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, some spirits are not ready to sleep. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed these terrifying cemetery stories and want more true horror content, make sure to subscribe for more chilling tales every week. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, not everything that wanders through a cemetery is alive.